Chapter 1. Ponta Porra, Brazil. They found him in Ponta Porra, a pleasant little town in Brazil, on the border of Paraguay. He lived alone in a small house on Rua Tiradentes and drove a red 1983 Volkswagen. He was thinner. His skin and hair were darker, and his nose and chin were different. They considered taking him quickly, but decided to wait. When he went downtown, they followed him and took photos. They listened as he talked to a clerk in the market. His Portuguese was excellent, almost without an accent. They watched as he ran along Rua Tiradentes and into the countryside. He was serious about his running, and this pleased them. Danilo would simply run into their arms. Guy was from Washington, D.C., and had been hired to find Danilo. He'd been searching for him for 4 years and had spent $3.5 million, all for nothing. But now he'd found him. Osmar and his Brazilian friends didn't know why Guy wanted Danilo, but they guessed that he'd disappeared and taken a lot of money. They made large copies of the photos and put them on the wall of the small house they were staying in. They studied them carefully. Was it really him? Osmar wanted to take him now, but Guy said they'd wait. Then, on the 4th day, Danilo raced to the airport, parked his car, got on a small plane to São Paulo, and was gone. They waited, watching the red Volkswagen and the arriving planes. Osmar was confident that Danilo would return, and they'd get him. He returned on the 5th day, and everyone was happy. Every day, Danilo ran his 10-kilometer course, leaving at almost the same time. On the 8th day, when Danilo came over the top of a hill, a small car with a flat tire was blocking the road. Its trunk was open. The young driver pretended to be surprised at the sight of the thin runner. "Bom dia." The man used Danilo's keys to open the door to his house. He collected all the computer disks. He went through the files on the desk, but couldn't find what he was looking for. 5 minutes after the door opened, a silent signal was sent, and a phone call was made. It informed the person on the other end that the house had been entered by a stranger. The directions in the guard's file were clear. Do not call the police. Call a number in Rio and ask for Eva Miranda. Eva put the phone down. The message meant that Danilo was missing. She told herself to relax. She'd need to be calm to do what she had to do. She took a file from a locked drawer and read the sheet of instructions again. Danilo's instructions were general. The details were left to her. She divided the money. She'd made the list of imaginary companies in which the money was hidden. Danilo had never seen her list. As a lawyer, she worked with international businessmen and understood foreign money and banking. She knew how to move money around the world, and Danilo had taught her more. At the moment, the money was in 2 places, a bank in Panama and one in Bermuda. Because European banks were closed now, she'd keep the money in the Caribbean for a few hours. She faxed instructions to move it out of Panama and Bermuda and into banks on Grand Cayman and in the Bahamas. As time passed, and there was no phone call from Danilo, she became more concerned. He wouldn't disappear without telling her first. But if they'd found him, they wouldn't wait long before they tried to make him talk. That was what he feared the most. That was why she had to run. She went to a payphone in the entrance of her office building and called the office of the FBI in Biloxi, Mississippi, asking for Agent Joshua Cutter. When he came to the phone, she asked,
"Are you in charge of the Patrick Lanigan investigation?"
She knew he was. There was a pause. Then he said, "Yes? Who is this?"
"I'm calling from Brazil,"
she said. Chapter 2. Paraguay. Danilo was lying on a board with holes in it. Ropes through the holes and around his ankles, knees, waist, chest, and wrists held him tightly against it. A Brazilian doctor stepped into the room and pushed a needle into his arm. The drug ran into Danilo's body. Guy entered the room alone. "Hello, Patrick," he said. Danilo knew that his quiet life on Rua Tiradentes was finished. He wasn't Danilo Silva now. He was Patrick again. For 4 years, he'd wondered how he'd feel if they caught him. Now he knew. He was extremely frightened. "Can you hear me, Patrick?" Guy asked. "We know who you are. You're Patrick Lanigan from Biloxi, Mississippi. You're a lawyer. You have a wife and a daughter, age 6. You've been missing now for over 4 years." "That's me." "Tell me, Patrick, did you watch your own funeral?" "Yes, I watched it." "Where did you hide after your funeral?" "Here and there." "Where's the money, Patrick?" Guy asked with a smile. "What money?" "The money you took with you." "Oh, that money," Patrick said. Then he lost consciousness. More men entered the room. They cut his clothes off and shaved several parts of his body. Then they taped small metal plates to the shaved skin. Wires connected to the metal went across his body to a box in Guy's hand. Patrick told himself that they weren't going to kill him. He'd imagined this situation 1,000 times and prayed it would never happen. But he'd always known it would. He always knew they were out there, searching for him. He closed his eyes, tried to breathe regularly, and struggled to control his thoughts. "I don't know where the money is. I don't know where the money is," he repeated silently. Until today, he'd called Eva every day between 4. Guy held the box close to Patrick's face. "See this?" he said. "When I push this lever, electricity will pass through the wires to the metal plates on your skin. Now where's the money?" "I don't know. I swear." Guy pushed the lever, and electricity shot through Patrick's body, burning his skin. He closed his eyes and mouth tightly, making an effort not to scream. But he stopped trying after a second and screamed loudly. "Tell me where the money is, and you'll leave this room alive. We'll take you back to Pontapura. We won't tell the FBI." Guy paused.
If, however, you refuse to tell me where the money is, then you'll never leave this room alive. Do you understand, Patrick?
Yes. I swear, I don't know. If I knew, I'd tell you. Guy pushed the lever down. I don't know! Patrick screamed in pain. I swear I don't know! Guy waited a few seconds for Patrick to recover. Then he asked calmly,
Where's the money?
I don't know! Patrick's screams filled the house. They left him alone for a few minutes to suffer and think about what would happen next. His skin was red from the heat and electricity. Blood ran from under the tape on his chest where the metal was burning into his flesh. The ropes around his wrists and ankles had rubbed away his skin. Then Guy returned alone and sat on a chair next to Patrick.
Where were you during the funeral? He asked.
Patrick relaxed a little. Finally, there was a question that wasn't about money. Maybe if he cooperated, they wouldn't torture him again.
I was hiding in Biloxi, he said.
Of course. And you watched your own funeral?
Yes. I was in a tree.
Where did you go after the funeral? Guy asked.
To Mobile, Alabama.
You changed your appearance?
Yes.
Guy shouted, and the other Americans rushed in. The Brazilian doctor pushed another needle roughly into Patrick's arm and left. The tape recorder was turned on. Guy stood, ready to move the lever if Patrick didn't talk.
The money arrived by wire to your law firm's bank account in Nassau on March 26, 1992, 45 days after your death. You were there, Patrick, pretending to be someone else. We have photos taken by the bank's hidden camera. A short time after the money arrived, it was gone, sent by wire to a bank in Malta. You stole it, Patrick. Now, where is it? Tell me, and you'll live.
Patrick looked at Guy, then at the lever, and closed his eyes tightly.
I swear, I don't know what you're talking about, he said.
Patrick. Guy pushed the lever down. Patrick's scream was so loud and terrible that Osmar and the Brazilians in the yard stopped their conversation. 100 meters away, a Brazilian guarding the house offered a prayer. The apartment in Curitiba was near the airport. Eva told the taxi driver to wait while she went inside. She knew exactly what to do. She went to the locked file cabinet, opened the 3 drawers, took out the financial records, and put them in a suitcase to take with her. Danilo couldn't know where his papers were. Then she quickly left and was driven to a small hotel downtown. In her room, she unpacked her small fax machine and connected it to the phone line. The Asian and Zurich banks were open now. Soon, the bed was covered with sheets of instructions to move the money. She was tired, but she couldn't sleep. Danilo had said they'd come looking for her. She couldn't go home. Her thoughts weren't on money, but on him. Was he alive? If so, how much was he suffering? How much had he told them? She wiped her eyes and began to arrange the papers. Chapter 3. Return to North America. Mrs. Stefano was going crazy. Several neighbors had called about the FBI agents parked in front of their house. She didn't care what her husband did at the office. She did, however, care a lot about what the neighbors might think. She went to bed at midnight. At 3 a.m., the doorbell rang, and Jack, who had fallen asleep on the sofa, answered it. 4 agents were there, and he quickly recognized Hamilton Janes, Assistant Director of the FBI. The men went to Stefano's living room and sat down. Janes said, "We're working on the Lanigan case. We've been informed that your people have him. Is this true?" "No." Stefano remained calm. "I'm prepared to arrest you." "What for?" Stefano asked. "Hiding a person wanted by the government. Lack of cooperation with the government's investigation. We'll include anything we need to. I just want to put you in jail. Then we'll arrest the rest of your firm and your clients. We'll take care of the indictments later, depending on whether or not we get Lanigan. Do you understand?" "Yes, I think so." "Where's Lanigan?" Janes asked. "I want him. Now." Stefano thought for a moment. In these circumstances, cooperation sounded like a good idea. If Patrick was given a choice of life in prison, he might make the money appear. "All right. Give me 24 hours, and I'll give you Lanigan. And you stop threatening to arrest me." "Agreed. I need to know where to pick him up." "Send a plane to Asuncion, Paraguay." "He'd better be okay. If he has any marks on his body, you'll be responsible." Janes and his agents left. Stefano called Guy. "Is he talking? What do you know?" he asked. "A little. The money still exists. He doesn't know where it is. It's controlled by a woman in Rio. Chapter 4. Biloxi. Since Patrick's disappearance, the remaining 4 partners in his law firm had had problems. They drank too much alcohol and argued a lot. They'd buried Patrick on February 11th, 1992. But 6 weeks later, he somehow stole their money. Money they'd already spent on new homes, big boats, and vacation houses in the Caribbean. Now, they were desperate to get their money back. Bogan and Vitrano were at their desks when Agent Cutter entered their office. "We have Patrick," he said. The 2 partners were shocked. "How'd you find him? Are you sure it's him?" Vitrano asked. "We're sure. We didn't find him. He was given to us. Do you know a man named Jack Stefano?" They both whispered, "Yes." "Do you work with him?" They both shook their heads. "You're lucky. Stefano's men found Patrick, tortured him, almost killed him, and then gave him to us." "What about the money?" Bogan asked. "We don't know anything about it. We'll watch Stefano. Maybe he'll lead us to the money." Vitrano and Bogan stared at the table, thinking. Patrick had stolen $90 million. Too much money for one person to spend. There must be millions left.
The money will be easy to find, Vitrano said. Somebody was buried in Patrick's grave. Patrick killed him. It's clearly a death penalty case in Mississippi. Patrick will talk to avoid the death penalty. Cutter looked at his watch. I have to go, he said. I have to give Trudy the good news. When Patrick was killed in a car crash with no witnesses, his wife Trudy received $2.5 million from his life insurance. She immediately bought an expensive house and an expensive car. She was excited about her good fortune. Lance, Trudy's boyfriend, opened the door when Cutter knocked. Agent Cutter, FBI. I've come to see Trudy. She's in there, Lance said, pointing. Before the press conference, Cutter and Morris Mast, the U.S. Attorney for the district, met with Raymond Sweeney, the local sheriff, and T.L. Parrish, the local district attorney, to decide what to do about Patrick. We have two big mysteries, two questions that must be answered, Parrish said. The big one is money. Where is it? What did he do with it? Can we recover it and give it to its owners? The second mystery is who's buried in Patrick's grave. Only Patrick can tell us that, and he won't unless he's forced to. He must be scared, Morris. Parchman's a frightening place. Patrick won't want to go to Parchman. Everyone in the room knew about the horrors of the local prison. Patrick would realize that if he talked, he might be sent to a government prison instead, one that wasn't so terrible. Parrish and Mast made a plan to work together. The FBI would continue its search for the money. The locals would concentrate on the murder. Mast and Parrish went together to the press conference. Mast spoke first. We're pleased to announce the capture of Mr. Patrick S. Lanigan, formerly of Biloxi. He's alive and well, and we have him in a hospital. He paused, and then told them the details of Patrick's capture. He didn't mention that the FBI wasn't responsible for finding Patrick. Parrish promised a quick indictment for murder. Patrick's story was the big news that day. Lanigan back from the dead, the newspapers reported on the front page. There were stories about Patrick's capture and Trudy's request for a divorce. The law firm partners were suing Patrick for the return of their $30 million. Northern Case Insurance was suing Trudy for the return of their money. Benny Arathea was suing Patrick for the return of his $60 million. And Monarch Sierra Insurance wanted to recover the $4 million they paid the law firm when Patrick stole their money. The story was also on all the TV stations. CNN, Chapter 5, The Base Hospital. Patrick walked down the hospital hall with the help of Louise, his nurse. His skin was burned in 4 places, and his whole body ached. He stopped and looked out a window. Yes, he'd admitted that the money still existed. With electricity running through his body, he'd told them what happened to the money after he stole it. He couldn't remember the last part of his torture. He'd been near death. He'd called her name. But was it to himself or aloud? Where was she now? When they returned to his room,
Luis closed the door and curtains and took out a camera. Luis had agreed to take the photos when Patrick offered him $500. "Start there," Patrick told him, pointing to the bottom of the bed. "Get the whole body, including the face." Luis did as he was told and worked quickly. When he finished, he took the film to a photo shop. Sandy McDermott had read reports about the discovery of his law school friend with great interest. He was busy in his New Orleans office when his secretary announced that a woman from Brazil was waiting to see him.
"My name's Leah,"
she said quietly.
"Patrick sent me."
Sandy noticed that she didn't smile, and her eyes were tired. "Have you spoken to him since—"
"No, not since he was taken. I want to hire you to be Patrick's lawyer."
"I'm available." Sandy had a lot of questions, but he knew he couldn't ask them now.
"You might be threatened by some very nasty people,"
she told him. "Who?"
"The people chasing Patrick."
"I think they've caught him," he said.
"Yes, but they don't have the money."
"I understand," he said. So, the money hadn't been spent. That wasn't surprising. But how much was left? "Where is the money?" he asked.
"You can't ask that question,"
she said. "What do you want me to do for him?" On the plane, Sandy and Leah didn't talk much. Just before landing in Miami, she said,
"I won't see you again for a few days. I have to keep moving. Patrick will give you instructions, and he and I will communicate through you. Be careful. When people learn that you're his lawyer, you'll attract the attention of the people who are looking for me."
"Who are they?" he asked.
"Patrick will tell you."
"You have the money, don't you?"
"I can't answer that question."
When they landed, she shook his hand and said,
"Tell Patrick I'm fine."
Then she disappeared into the crowd. When he landed in San Juan, Sandy went to the Navy base to visit Patrick. The two old friends hadn't seen each other for 6 years. Patrick sat in his bed in the dark room. He kept a sheet over his body. Sandy studied his face. It was thin, and the chin and nose were different. He looked like someone else, but his eyes and voice were the same. "Thanks for coming," Patrick said. "Sure," Sandy replied. "She said to tell you she's fine," he added. Patrick closed his eyes and said a prayer of thanks. Then he was silent. Sandy sat and waited for his friend. He was alive, and right now nothing else mattered. After a time, Sandy wanted to talk. "A lot of people are waiting for you back in Biloxi," he said. "Trudy filed for divorce 2 days ago. The grand jury has indicted you for capital murder." "I know," said Patrick. "CNN has kept me informed." Sandy paused and then asked, "When do you want to talk?" Patrick rolled to his side and looked at the wall. "They tortured me, Sandy," he said quietly. "They taped wires to my body and gave me electric shocks until I talked. Here, look." He lifted his left arm so Sandy could inspect the burn marks. "They kept asking about the money. I'm afraid I told them about the girl, Sandy." "The lawyer?"
Leah? Yes. I'm almost certain I told him about Leah.
At 6 o'clock the next morning, Patrick's doctor entered his room. He checked his wounds and said, "You're ready to go. They have good doctors waiting for you where you're going." Then he left. 30 minutes later, Agent Brent Myers from the Biloxi office walked in. "Good morning, Patrick. I just talked to your doctor. You're going home tomorrow, and I've got orders to take you back. We'll leave in the morning on a special Air Force plane to Biloxi. See you early in the morning." Myers left. Next, Luis arrived with coffee and fruit. He put a package under Patrick's sheet and asked if he needed anything else. "No," Patrick said, thanking him softly. An hour later, Sandy arrived. "I want you to go home immediately," Patrick said, "and take this with you." He handed Sandy the package. Sandy sat down, opened it, and looked through the photos. "Who did this to you?" he asked. "Whose prisoner am I?" "The FBI's." "So, I think the FBI did it to me. My own government found me, caught me, tortured me, and is now taking me back. Look at what they've done to me." "You should sue them for this," Sandy said. "For millions, and quickly. Here's the plan. I'm leaving for Biloxi in the morning. We should file our lawsuit late this afternoon, so it'll be in the paper tomorrow. Tell the press. I've marked 2 photos. Give them to the reporters for the Coast paper, the one that's read by the people who will be on my jury. People will feel sorry for me, an American citizen tortured by the FBI." Sandy studied Patrick's face. "It wasn't really the FBI, was it?" he asked. "No," Patrick said, "it wasn't. I was delivered to the FBI by some people whose names I don't know. They'd been chasing me for a long time, and they're still waiting out there somewhere." "Does the FBI know about them?" "Yes," Patrick said. He paused. "Be careful. I've hidden a lot of money, Sandy. There are people who'll do anything to find it." "How much of the money is—" Chapter 6. Return to Biloxi. Newspaper, TV, and radio reporters waited in the courthouse while Sandy filed the lawsuit. They listened carefully as he calmly informed them that his client was suing the FBI for physical damage and torture. Sandy answered questions and then reached into his case and removed 2 large color photos. "This is what they did to Patrick," he said. The cameras moved closer. "This is your government, FBI agents at work, ladies and gentlemen, torturing an American citizen." Everyone was shocked. Almost half of the 6 o'clock news was about Sandy and the photos. The other half was about Patrick's return the next day. CNN played the story hourly. Hamilton Janes was at his club when he saw the news. He wasn't happy. The FBI sued by Patrick Lanigan? He excused himself and went to his office. He made a phone call, and 2 agents went immediately to Jack Stefano's front door. Stefano had watched the reports and wasn't surprised to see the FBI. He thought it was funny that the FBI was being blamed for his men's work. He also thought it was a good idea of Patrick's. "Good evening," he said politely. "FBI, the first man said. "Mr. Janes would like to see you." "Why?" "We don't know," the second man said. "He told us to find you and take you to his office. Can you come with us?" Stefano was angry, but he reminded himself that there were already criminal charges against him because of the Lanigan case. A little more cooperation might help. "Give me 5 minutes," he said. When Stefano entered his office, Janes dropped the thick report he was looking at. It was almost midnight. "What did you do to that boy down there?" "I don't know. I guess the Brazilian boy's got a little rough. He'll live." "This is serious business, okay, Jack? These allegations are terrible. Right now, the whole country is looking at those pictures and wondering why we tortured an American citizen. Who did it?" The doctor gave Patrick pills to make him comfortable for the flight and a file with his medical records. Patrick thanked him. He shook hands with Luis and said goodbye. Agent Myers was waiting outside the door with 4 Navy policemen. "If you behave, I won't put chains on you now," he said. "When we land, though, I have no choice." "Thanks," Patrick said. His legs ached and his knees were weak, but he held his head high and his back straight as he walked down the hall and out to the waiting van. As the van drove slowly across the base, Patrick thought about his life in Pontapora, his home now. He wondered what jail they'd put him in Biloxi. Then he had an idea. He opened the file and quickly read the doctor's notes. Patient should remain hospitalized for at least another week, the doctor had written. This would keep him out of jail. He had to tell Sandy to arrange a comfortable private room for him. "I need to make a phone call," he said. When the van stopped, he and Myers went to a small office and faxed the doctor's instructions to Sandy. Then they climbed the steps into the Air Force plane. The plane landed at Keesler Air Force Base outside Biloxi. Patrick was surprised there wasn't a crowd waiting for him. He wanted the press to see him with chains on his legs and wrists. But they'd been forbidden to come near the plane. Only Agent Cutter, Sheriff Sweeney, 2 Air Force officers, and Sandy were there. "Hello, Patrick. Welcome home," the sheriff said. "Hello, Raymond," Patrick answered with a smile. They knew each other well. Cutter started to introduce himself, but as soon as Patrick heard FBI, he turned to Sandy. They all got into the waiting van. Patrick was glad the chase was over. Lots of problems were ahead, but for now, he could ignore what was behind him. Patrick had never been able to completely relax and enjoy his new life. Not even the money could calm his fears. He'd always known that this day would come. He'd stolen too much money. He looked out the window as he rode along. CD 2. Chapter 7. Patrick's First Appearance. Cutter and Ted Grimshaw, chief investigator for the district, carefully examined the evidence from Patrick's death. There wasn't much. No one suspected murder when Patrick died, so there was no effort to gather physical clues. There were 10 large color photos of the burned-out Chevy Blazer. After the car burned, there was very little left of the body in it, and that was buried. So now they had no idea who'd died in the crash. Patrick had spent that weekend in an old cabin near the edge of the forest outside Biloxi. Sunday night, February 9th, 1992, he called to tell his wife he was leaving the cabin. He stopped at Verhall's country store and bought 50 liters of gasoline. An hour later, Patrick's Chevy Blazer was found burning at the bottom of a steep hill 12 kilometers down the road. The fire was so hot that they couldn't rescue the driver. They read the license plate, and at 3:30 a.m., Trudy received the call that made her a widow. The next day, they discovered a shoe near the Blazer. When they showed it to Trudy, she recognized it as Patrick's and cried. His funeral was the following day. Dr. Hayani was happy to sit and chat with Patrick. He enjoyed being close to this patient who was in all the news reports. He encouraged Patrick to talk about his experience. The torture was something I could never accurately describe, Patrick said after an hour. Sleep is impossible. I hear voices, then I smell my flesh burning, and then I wake up. And it's not getting any better. They're still out there, still after me. I can't sleep. I don't want to sleep. I'll get tortured again. He paused. Doc, I need to stay here as long as I can. They'll want to put me in jail, in a cell with other criminals. I can't live like that. But why do they want to move you? It's pressure, Doc. They have to slowly increase. For the third day, Patrick didn't wash his hair or shave. The world was waiting to see him today. He wore the same clothes he'd worn every day. He didn't wear socks. He wanted people to see the rope marks just above his ankles. Sandy arrived at 10 and gave Patrick a pair of dark glasses he'd requested. Patrick sat on the edge of his bed and tried to breathe slowly. I never thought this day would come. Never, he said. I'll do all the talking, Sandy said. Just try and relax. Sheriff Sweeney knocked and entered with his assistants. Patrick put on the dark glasses and was led out of the building to a waiting car. Sandy stayed on his left, gently holding him by the elbow. Patrick looked out the window as they drove through Biloxi and noticed the changes since he'd left. He started to relax. Then they turned onto Main Street, and he was anxious again. In the middle of the old shops and stores was the large white building where he'd been a partner in Bogan, Rapley, Vitrano, Haverack, and Lanigan, attorneys. The car stopped in front of the courthouse, where a crowd of reporters, photographers, and cameramen was waiting. Patrick lowered his head and tried to hide among the sheriff's assistants. They walked him quickly into the courthouse as the press called out questions. Patrick, what's it like to be home? Where's the money? Who burned in the car? Sandy and Sheriff Sweeney stayed with Patrick in the jury room. Are you okay, Patrick? Sweeney asked. Yes, sure, Raymond. Thanks. He sounded scared, and his hands and knees shook. There was a knock on the door, and a pretty girl entered and said,
Welcome back, Patrick. Judge Husky would like to meet with you. He'll be here in a few minutes.
She and Sweeney left and closed the door. Finally, Patrick was alone with his lawyer. A couple of things. First, Leah will contact you soon. I've written her a long letter, and I'd like you to give it to her. Okay. Second, there's a small machine for finding bugs. Crowded courtrooms were not uncommon for trials, but no one could remember such a crowded room for a simple first appearance. The press had taken the best seats. Many lawyers were there just to see Patrick. The papers had been full of stories about him for 4 days. The torture story had increased their curiosity. Charles Bogan and Doug Vitrano sat together. They'd wanted to sit in the front row to make eye contact with Patrick and threaten him quietly. But they were in the fifth. A few other lawyers had come to give Patrick their support. Escape was a common dream of many small-town lawyers. At least Patrick had had the courage to chase the dream. Many other people were present who'd hardly known Patrick, but now suddenly claimed to have been his friends. The door opened, and Sheriff Sweeney entered, holding Patrick by the elbow. Sandy followed. Patrick walked slowly, head down, across the room to the defendant's table. He sat down, his shoulders low, chin down. Sandy put his arm on his shoulder. The door opened again, and T.L. Parrish, the district attorney, entered alone. He walked to his table next to Patrick's and sat beside Sheriff Sweeney. Behind him were agents Joshua Cutter, Brent Myers, and 2 others. Judge Husky entered and sat down.
State against Patrick S. Lanigan. Would the defendant please rise?
Patrick slowly stood.
Mr. Lanigan, I'm holding a copy of an indictment against you by the grand jury. It states that you murdered a human being, name unknown. Have you read this indictment and discussed it with your attorney?
Yes, sir, Patrick announced.
What is your plea?
Not guilty.
Your plea of not guilty is accepted. You may sit down.
He paused.
Any questions from the attorneys?
The lawyers said nothing.
Parrish stood and said, Your Honor, we would like to put the accused in jail as soon as possible. As you know, he's at the base hospital now. I just talked to his doctor.
Sandy's secretary was cutting out his photo and the story of yesterday's court appearance from the New Orleans paper when the phone call came. She found him immediately. It was Leah Pirege. She said hello and asked if he'd had his office checked for bugs. Sandy said yes. She was in a hotel room a few blocks away and suggested that they meet there. Sandy was excited to hear her voice and would do whatever she wanted. Leah greeted him with a smile and poured coffee for both of them.
How is he?
She asked.
He's getting better. The doctor says he'll be fine.
How bad was it?
She asked quietly.
Pretty bad.
He reached into his case, removed a file, and handed it to her. She looked at the photos and cried.
Poor Patrick,
she said to herself.
Poor baby.
I'm sorry, Sandy said. Here's a letter from Patrick. She finished crying and poured more coffee.
Are any of the injuries permanent?
She asked.
The doctor thinks they'll get better with time.
Mentally, how is he?
He's okay. He doesn't sleep much and has bad dreams. But he's getting better. I guess he's lucky to be alive.
He always said they wouldn't kill him.
She paused and changed the subject.
Let's talk about his divorce.
She stood, walked to a drawer, removed a thick file, and placed it in front of Sandy.
Did you see Trudy on TV?
She asked. Yes.
Patrick hates her. She's a bad person, and she was unfaithful to him the whole time they were married. It's all in his file. The last year they were together, Patrick hired an investigator to watch her. There are photographs of her lover, Lance Maxa, coming and going from Patrick's house when he was away. There are also pictures of Lance and Trudy sitting by Patrick's pool, without clothes.
Sandy took the file and looked through it until he found the photographs. He smiled. This will help.
Patrick wants the divorce, you understand. He won't fight it.
Chapter 8. Stefano's Story. Stefano's lawyer advised him to accept the FBI's arrangement. The criminal charges against him would be dropped, and there would be no charges against his clients. He would tell the FBI everything he knew about the search for and capture of Patrick Lanigan. Stefano had easily persuaded Benny Arethea that the FBI was going to arrest him soon. It was more difficult to persuade Paul Adderson at Monarch Sierra Insurance and Frank Gill at Northern Case Insurance. Janes sent agents to both offices to ask questions about the search for and capture of Patrick Lanigan. Both called Stefano by noon and told him to fully cooperate with the FBI. For 4 years, Stefano had worked with these men. He'd earned almost $1 million. He'd spent another $2.5 million of his clients' money, and he could claim success. They'd found Lanigan. They hadn't found the $90 million, but it hadn't been spent. There was a chance of recovering it. Benny Arethea came to see Stefano in his office. He'd listened to the torture tape 3 times. He was certain Patrick had told what he knew, and it wasn't enough. Patrick knew he'd someday be caught. That's why he'd placed the money with the girl, who hid it from everyone, including Patrick. It was a great plan. "How much will it take to find her?" he asked Stefano. "I'd guess 100,000, with no guarantees. We have no idea where she is, but we know where she's from, and we know she'll probably go to Biloxi." "Will the FBI know we're still looking?" "No." "And if you find her?" "We'll make her talk," Stefano said, and they smiled. Stefano honestly planned to tell most of what he knew. He knew little, just the name of the Brazilian lawyer who had the money. Now she'd disappeared, and he doubted the FBI would follow her. The money didn't belong to them. And he wanted the FBI out of his life. Mrs. Stefano was extremely anxious. Stefano sat at a table in the FBI office, his lawyer beside him. "What does your company do?" asked Underhill. "Lots of things," Stefano said. "Watch people, get information, find missing persons." "Were you hired to find Patrick Lanigan?" "Yes, on March 28, 1992. "Who hired you?" "Benny Arethea, the man whose money was stolen." "What did you do after you were hired?" "I immediately flew to Nassau in the Bahamas to meet with the manager of the bank where the theft took place." "Why did Arethea have an account outside the U.S.?
It was $90 million. Nobody wanted the money to appear in a bank in Biloxi.
Where did it come from?
Here, in Washington. The wire began at 9:30 on the morning of March 26, 1992. At 15 minutes after 10, it reached the United Bank, where it sat for 9 minutes before it was wired to a bank in Malta. From there, it was wired to Panama.
How did the money get wired out of the bank?
Someone, Mr. Lanigan, we think, prepared false wiring instructions from my client's lawyers, his old firm, and rerouted the money. On the morning the money was wired, he presented himself as Doug Vetrano, one of his partners. He had a perfect passport and driver's license, and he knew all about the money which was being wired from Washington. He had a paper from the office giving him permission to accept the money for the firm and then wire it to the bank in Malta. The other partners, of course, thought he was dead. They had no reason to suspect anyone was after the money. The settlement which produced the $90 million was extremely secret, and only a few people knew exactly when or where the money was wired.
So you went to Biloxi to look for clues, and you found that the law offices were bugged.
We did. We had 2 jobs. First, to find Mr. Lanigan and the money, and second, to find out how he'd stolen it. There were 22 bugs in the offices, in every phone, in every office, under every desk.
Did you find out where the signals went? He asked.
No, but I think he rented a boat. He needed a place to hide and listen to the conversations. A boat is simple and safe.
Benny Arathea had moved to the coast in 1985 as an officer of Platt and Rockland, a big defense contractor with a history of overbilling and false claims. One of their small divisions had received a $990 million Navy contract, and Benny was responsible for it. He hated contracting with the government, and he hated living in Biloxi. In 1988, he asked for a different job and was denied. He studied the False Claims Act. This encouraged people to report overbilling in government contracts. Then he went to Charles Bogan for help filing a claim with the government. The lawsuit was filed in September of 1990, with the allegation that $600 million had been overbilled. If Benny could prove this, he'd receive 15% of that amount, and 1/3 of that would go to the law firm. Bogan gave information to the press, and the company lost business. After a year, Platt and Rockland agreed to repay the $600 million. Benny got ready to receive his fortune, and Bogan and the partners got ready to spend theirs. Then Patrick disappeared, and so did their money. Stefano's next questioner was Warren.
When did your group form? He asked. After we lost Patrick in New York, we waited. Nothing happened. I'd met with Benny Arathea, and he agreed to pay $1 million to finance the search. Then I met with people from Monarch Sierra and Northern Case. Northern Case had already paid $2.5 million to the widow. They couldn't sue to get it back because there wasn't strong evidence he was still alive. They agreed to give us $500,000. Monarch Sierra carried the law firm's insurance, protecting them from theft by its employees and partners. They had to pay $4 million to the firm and agreed to pay another $1 million to finance the search. How was the money spent? On salaries, travel, rewards, and the services of my firm.
Not much is left. Tell me about the rewards. We immediately offered a $100,000 reward for any information about the disappearance of... Chapter 9. The Divorce. Sweeney and Grimshaw visited Patrick. They photographed him and took his fingerprints. Then the two men joined Cutter in his office, where an FBI fingerprint man was waiting for them. When Pepper's gun was found in Patrick's cabin, Grimshaw had taken fingerprints from it. The fingerprint man compared those with Patrick's. "Several of these are perfect matches," he said. "The gun was covered with Lanigan's prints." Certainly good news, they thought. Patrick demanded a different room for all future meetings with his attorney, and Dr. Hayani quickly made the necessary arrangements. Patrick also requested a wheelchair. A nurse pushed him to the room where Sandy was waiting. "Did you get the machine for finding bugs?" Patrick asked. "It'll be here in a few days. You should relax a little. You've lived in fear, always looking over your shoulder. But those days are over. They caught you. Relax." "They're still out there. They have me, but not the money. And the money's much more important. They won't rest until they have it. The people who lost their money have spent a fortune trying to find it." "How do you know? Who are they?" There was a long pause. "Sit down," Patrick said. Sandy removed the thick file Leah had given him 4 hours earlier, and Patrick recognized it immediately. "When did you see her?" he asked anxiously. "This morning. She's fine, sends her love, and says nobody's following her yet. She asked me to deliver this." Patrick opened the envelope, pulled out a 3-page letter, and read it. Sandy looked through the file and took out pictures of Trudy and Lance. When Patrick finished reading, he said, "I have another letter for her." Then he saw the photos on the table. "Good work, isn't it?" "It's amazing. I've never seen so much proof in a divorce case." "Well, I learned about Lance after we'd been married almost 2 years. Trudy was going to have a baby, so I said nothing. But a year later, I started gathering evidence. I wasn't sure when I'd need it, but I knew the marriage was over. I left town every chance I could." Sandy left, and Riddleton went to see Trudy and Lance. He told them Patrick knew she'd had a lover. Trudy acted shocked. "Do you deny it?" Riddleton asked.
"Absolutely," she said.
"Of course," added Lance. "The man's lying."
"Patrick hired investigators," Riddleton told them, handing them one of the reports. Trudy and Lance looked at each other. They'd been caught, but they weren't ashamed.
"Can these investigators talk in court?" Lance asked.
"We're not going to court," Riddleton said.
"Why not?"
Trudy asked.
"Because of these."
Riddleton put the photos in front of them. They were shocked. Trudy started to cry.
"He's not getting my daughter,"
she said. "Relax," Riddleton said. "He doesn't want the kid. He's not the father." They both thought about that while Riddleton got out a report. "He had a DNA test done." He looked at Lance and added, "Congratulations." Trudy was angry.
"So what do we do?"
"It's simple. You give up your right to his money and property, and he gives you the divorce and the kid."
"But I'm going to lose everything,"
she said.
"Look what he's done to me. I got $2.5 million when he died, and now the insurance company wants to take it all back. Can I sue him for mental cruelty?
No. Look, it's very simple. You get the divorce and the kid, and Patrick keeps whatever money is out there. And everything is private. If you don't agree, he'll give the reports and photos to the press.
Where do I sign?
She asked. It was past time to leave for the day, but Dr. Hyani stopped to see his famous patient. "Welcome to my office," Patrick said. He was sitting at a small table, which was now his desk. A pile of legal papers was in one corner. "Nice," Hyani said. "How are you doing?" "I'm fine," he answered, as he always did. Patrick sat on the edge of his bed and looked at his doctor. "Can I tell you something?" he asked sincerely.
Certainly.
Chapter 10. Patrick's Story. As Judge Carl Husky drove to the hospital the next afternoon, he thought about how Patrick had changed physically in the months before his disappearance. He'd gained weight steadily. A month before he disappeared, he told Carl that he weighed 150 kilos. He grew a beard and let his hair grow long. He didn't look like the Patrick they found in Brazil. Although others had forgotten about Patrick a few months after his disappearance, Carl had thought about his friend every day. It was hard to believe he was really back. When he entered the dark room, Patrick was sitting in bed with his shirt off. "Thanks for coming," he said.
Nasty burns,
Carl said, as Patrick put his shirt on. "It was ugly," Patrick said. "Doc says they're getting better, but I need to stay here."
I have no problem with that, and I'm the one who decides where you stay.
Patrick seemed to relax a bit. "Thanks, Carl. You know I can't live in the jail, and I'll kill myself before I go to Parchment."
I don't blame you. Let's talk about something pleasant.
"You said you can't keep this case. When will you give it to someone else? Who?"
Soon. Probably Trussell."
Carl stared at Patrick, who was unable to keep eye contact. This wasn't the same Patrick he'd known before. He decided to ask Patrick about his experiences.
Where'd you get that chin and nose?
"Bought them in Rio. Do you like them?"
They're handsome. I hear there are beautiful beaches in Brazil."
"Yes." There was a long silence. Carl realized that Patrick was in no hurry to talk, but he couldn't sit silently in the dark room much longer.
Look, Patrick, I'm not here as your judge. I'm not your lawyer. I'm your friend. You can talk to me.
I guess it sounds romantic, doesn't it? Disappearing and becoming somebody new. All your problems are left behind. You dream about that, don't you, Carl?
I guess everybody does at some time. How long did you plan it?
A long time. I seriously doubted that the baby was mine. Carl. They walked down the hall and sat looking out a window. "It was a Sunday, February the 9th, Patrick began. "I found the place for the accident the day before. At about 10 o'clock that night, I left the cabin. I stopped at Verhall's country store and bought some gas. 3 kilometers down the road, I turned onto a dirt road and stopped. I put on some protective clothes and drove back to the highway. At the top of a steep hill, I drove off the side of the road. I was scared when the car went into the air. It crashed and rolled onto its side. My shoulder hurt, but I was able to climb out. I took off the protective clothes and threw them into the blazer. Earlier that day, I'd hidden 4 cans of gasoline. I put 3 cans inside the car and poured the gasoline from the 4th can around the inside and outside of the car. Then I stepped back, lit a cigarette, and threw it into the car. It exploded like a bomb. He took a drink of soda. I ran to find the old motorcycle I'd hidden, pushed it up the hill, and rode away. Soon I was back at my cabin. I was scared, but I knew I was running to freedom and a new life. Patrick was dead. It was exciting. "What about the guy burning in the car, Patrick?" Carl almost asked. Instead, he said, "Weren't you afraid Pepper would see you?" Patrick studied his feet for a few seconds and then said, "Pepper was gone." Carl ordered a pizza. After they ate, he said, "You were at the cabin." "Yes. It was around 11:30. I covered the windows so no one would see the lights. Then I cut my hair and colored it dark brown, and I shaved my beard. I felt like a different person. I cleaned the cabin really well and left at 1 a.m. "Did you have any concern for Trudy?" "No. I knew she'd handle the shock well, and that she'd be a good widow for about a month. Then she'd get the life insurance money." "Pepper's gun, tent, and sleeping bag were found under one of the beds. How'd they get there?" Patrick looked at the wall. "I don't know." "Where'd you go?" Carl asked. The judge enjoyed the evening so much that he called Patrick the next day to see if they could do it again. Patrick was anxious for company. When he arrived, Carl sat next to Patrick's bed, and they ate the pizza he'd brought. "Why are you retiring?" Patrick asked. "How did you know I'm retiring? I haven't told many people, and you were in Brazil." "I had a spy, Carl." "Someone here?" "Of course not. I couldn't risk contacting anyone here. I had an attorney friend there. A woman." "Now I understand. She's the one who has the money." Patrick smiled and laughed. "What do you want to know about the money, Carl?" "Everything. Where is it? How much is left?" "I can't tell you where it is. There's more money now than I took." "How'd you do it?" Patrick walked across the room and stretched. Then he sat down on the edge of the bed. "I got lucky," he whispered. "I was leaving, Carl, with or without the money. I knew the money was coming to the firm, and I had a plan to get it. But if it didn't work, I was still leaving." "We got as far as your funeral last night." "Right. I stayed at Orange Beach a couple of days, listening to Portuguese language tapes. I also listened to conversations I'd recorded around the office. And I organized documents about Arathea. I learned how to sail, and then hid in the sailboat and watched Biloxi from there." "Why did you want to do that?" "I had the office bugged. I could listen to their conversations on the boat, and I recorded all of them." "Do you have these tapes?" "Of course. There were hundreds of them. At night, I listened to them and organized the important parts. I knew everything that was said in that office. I knew where the money was going and when it would get there." "So how'd you steal it?" "I flew to Miami. Then I used a false passport saying I was Doug Vetrano, flew to Nassau, and went to the bank that the money was being wired to. I was sitting in the manager's office drinking coffee when the wire came in. I immediately had the money wired out to a bank in Malta, with instructions to wire it on to Panama. When I left the bank, Chapter 11. Leah's Story. Paulo Miranda's last phone call from his daughter had been 2 days earlier. She was in a hotel in New Orleans. She was scared, though trying desperately not to show it. He was angry that she wouldn't give more details, and he was worried about her. And he was tired of the men who were following him everywhere he went. After finishing his work, he walked to his car in the parking lot. He was thinking, his eyes down. A small red van was parked next to his car. As he approached, the driver got out and opened the back door. But Paulo didn't notice. Osmar stopped Paulo and roughly pushed him into the van. The door closed. A gun was pointed between his eyes, and a voice told him to be silent. The van raced away. An hour and a half later, it stopped behind a farmhouse, and Paulo was led inside. He wouldn't be harmed, he was told, unless he tried to escape. A phone call to the police informed them of the kidnapping. Calls were made to Paulo's son in Rio, to the manager of Eva's apartment, and to one of her friends. The message was the same. Paulo Miranda had been kidnapped, and the police were investigating. Eva was staying in New York, moving frequently. She called her father, and there was no answer. Then she called her brother and learned about the kidnapping. He was going crazy. No, there hadn't been a request for money. Against Patrick's specific instructions, she called him, speaking in Portuguese.
Patrick, it's Leah,
she said, trying to show no emotion. What's wrong? He asked in Portuguese. He wasn't pleased to hear her voice.
It's my father,
she said, and told him the story of Paulo's disappearance.
I have to go home.
No, Leah, he said calmly. It's a trap. They're not asking for money. They want you. She played with her hair and watched the people rushing by.
So what do I do?
Go to New Orleans. Call Sandy when you get there. While she waited at the airport, she thought about her father and the terrible things they could be doing to him. They were hurting him because of her, and there was nothing she could do. Patrick called Sandy. When Dr. Hayani looked into Patrick's room in the morning, Patrick was sitting in a chair by the window, looking at the closed curtains. Patrick, are you okay? He asked. After a minute, Patrick answered, I'm fine, Doc, but I didn't sleep at all. You're safe now, Patrick. The sun's up. When he left, Patrick got up and walked to the door. Did you sleep well? The guard at the door asked, as he did every morning. I slept safe, Eddie. Thanks, Patrick said, as he did every morning. He returned to his room and did some exercises. The routine was the same every day. He wanted to be Danilo again, with his quiet life in his small house. He wanted to walk along the streets of Pontapora and run in the country. He missed Brazil, and he missed Eva, her soft touch, her beautiful smile. He couldn't live without her. He'd escaped before. Why couldn't he escape again? He'd have a perfect life with Eva. He'd put her in danger, and now he must protect her. Could he do it again? Or had his luck ended? Sandy met Cutter at 8 a.m. Do you remember that phone call you received 13 days ago? Sandy asked. The lady from Brazil?
Cutter said he did, and Sandy continued, I've met with her a few times. She's a lawyer for Patrick. He quickly explained most of what he knew about Leah, though he never mentioned her name. Then he asked about the Stefano investigation. Cutter became cautious.
How do you know about that?
The lady from Brazil knows all about Stefano. Remember? She gave you his name. He's still trying to get my client, and I'd like to stop him.
And how do you know this?
Because his men in Brazil have kidnapped the woman's father. Cutter's mouth opened, and he looked at the ceiling. Then it made sense.
Does she know where the money is?
That's a possibility. The kidnapping is an effort to make her go back to Brazil. Then they'll capture her and treat her like they treated Patrick. It's all about money.
There's not much we can do about it.
Yes, there is. Put pressure on Stefano. Tell him the... Sandy parked in front of the beach house. Leah answered the door with a smile. On the table was a box, and beside it were papers neatly arranged. This is the Arathea file, Leah said. Patrick prepared it. They sat at a small table in the kitchen and ate. How's Patrick? She asked.
Patrick's okay. The burns are getting better.
He ate a bit. I'm sorry. I forgot to ask about your father. I talked to my brother today, and there's still no word. It's difficult. I can't go home, and I can't stay here.
I'm very sorry, Leah.
He asked more questions. General questions. Not about the kidnapping. As he ate, she didn't touch her food. When he finished, they moved to the table with the box and papers on it. How much do you know about the Arathea matter? She asked.
Just the information that was in the paper.
These documents and tapes are the evidence for everything I'm going to tell you. The Arathea claim was false from the beginning. She spoke slowly. Benny Arathea made the plan to cheat both his company and his government. He was helped by some very good lawyers, Patrick's old firm, and a senator, Bogan's cousin, in Washington. Patrick was a new partner then. He wasn't included in the Arathea plan, but he knew something was happening. He found out that the secrecy was because of Arathea, and he was patient. He pretended to notice nothing, but he was gathering evidence. A lot of it's in his box.
Explain how the claim was false.
Arathea ran new coastal shipyards in Pascagoula. It's a small division of Platte and Rockland.
I know all that. They have big defense contracts and are known for cheating the government.
That's right. New Coastal was working on an enormous building program for the Navy. Arathea wrote false work records, claiming thousands of hours for work that was never done, for employees who never existed. He charged unbelievably high prices for materials. Drinking cups for $30 each, for example. He created piles of paperwork, very little with his name on it. He kept good records.
CD 3. Chapter 12. Stefano's Story. Continued. The third day, Underhill was back. We'll start where we stopped yesterday, Mr. Stefano. Your arrival in Brazil. Right. It's a big country, and has a history of being a great place to hide. We put together a file on Lanigan and had it translated into Portuguese. We had computer artists make pictures of his appearance. Then we hurried to Brazil and hired the best investigators we could find. In April 1994, we found the doctor who'd changed Lanigan's chin and nose. We knew then that he was in Brazil. Stefano's fourth meeting began early. The questioner was a new one, Oliver. "You were talking about the doctor who changed Lanigan's chin and nose," Oliver said. "Continue." Stefano got comfortable in his chair. "For a long time, we didn't find anything. Then, late in '94, we were contacted by an investigation firm in Atlanta, the Pluto Group. They said they might have some information I'd want. They had a mysterious client who claimed to know something about Lanigan. Obviously, I was interested. The client, not surprisingly, wanted lots of money. This was encouraging. If their client expected a big reward, then the client knew that Lanigan still had plenty of money. In July of '95, the Pluto Group approached me and said their client could lead us to a place in Brazil where Lanigan had recently lived. We agreed on the sum of $50,000. After the money was wired to a bank in Panama, I was given an address of an apartment building in the small city of Itajaí. We showed the manager our pictures of Patrick. He said the man's name was Jan Horst, a German who'd rented an apartment for 2 months. "What about the Pluto Group?" "We didn't hear much from them for 6 months. Then, in January of this year, they returned. Their client needed money and was ready to tell us everything. For a few $1,000,000, we could learn exactly where our man was. But their client wouldn't talk until the money was paid. And I wouldn't pay until their client talked." Eventually, Underhill joined Oliver after a coffee break. "We've seen the photos of the burns, Mr. Stefano, and we, the FBI, have been sued for the injuries caused by your men. Now tell us how you did it." "I wasn't there. I knew he'd be given electric shocks. I had no idea it would cause serious burns." Underhill and Oliver looked at each other in disbelief and whispered. They both asked a number of questions about the capture and questioning. Finally, they asked the most important question. "During the questioning of Mr. Lanigan, what did you learn about the money?" "Not much. He told us where the money had been, but it had been moved. The man who did the questioning believes that Mr. Lanigan didn't know where the money was." "Did Mr. Lanigan mention a partner?" "I don't know." They whispered again and then paused. Stefano waited nervously. Then the door opened and Hamilton Janes walked in, followed by Warren. "I've been listening in the next room," Janes said with a smile. "And suddenly I wonder if you're being truthful." Stefano was more anxious. "Of course I am." "Of course. Have you ever heard the name Eva Miranda? She's a lawyer in Rio. A friend of Patrick's." "No." "Well, that's what bothers me, Jack. I think you know exactly who she is. You're trying to find her." "I don't know what you're talking about," Stefano said weakly. Underhill spoke. "He's lying." Oliver and Warren agreed. Janes picked up a sheet of paper. "This is a story from a Rio paper this morning. It tells of the kidnapping of Mr. Paolo Miranda. His daughter is Patrick's friend, Jack. We've checked with the police in Rio. Nothing has been heard from the kidnappers. So where's Mr. Miranda? I don't know what you're talking about. Janes looked at the other end of the table. Still lying, Underhill said, and Oliver. Chapter 13. Ava. Leah didn't see the man at the supermarket at first, but then she turned and saw his green eyes staring at her. She calmly walked away. Minutes later, she saw him again, hiding his face, but watching every move she made. She was frightened, but remained calm as she walked through the store. She saw him once more in the store, and then saw him walking through the parking lot, carrying nothing. She paid for her groceries as calmly as possible, but her hands shook as she took her change. She got in her car and drove in the direction of the beach house, though she knew she could never go back there. After a kilometer, she turned quickly and saw him 3 cars behind her. She desperately wanted to see Patrick so she could scream at him. This was not part of their agreement. She drove on, remaining calm, as Patrick had taught her. The man with the green eyes wasn't following her now, but she knew others would be watching. An hour later, she entered the airport in Pensacola and bought a ticket for the next flight, which went to Miami. In Miami, she bought a one-way ticket to São Paulo. Why not visit her country? The agent at the passport checkpoint had seen an announcement that the FBI was looking for a young Brazilian woman, age 31, and pushed an alarm. A manager appeared and said, "Could you step in here, Ms. Pires?" He pointed to a row of doors.
Is there a problem?
She demanded as they walked. Not really, just a few questions. When they entered a small room, he asked about her reason for going to São Paulo. Then he asked, "Where's your baggage? According to our records, you entered the country 8 days ago. 8 days and no baggage? Seems odd, doesn't it?"
Is it a crime to travel without baggage?
She asked. No, but it is a crime to use a false passport in the U.S. Do you know a person by the name of Ava Miranda? Leah's heart stopped. Her face fell, and she knew the chase was at an end. The long table was piled with papers and files, and the Arathea box sat empty in a corner. Patrick and Sandy. Chapter 14. Settlements. At first, Bogan and Vetrano were happy when Patrick was found, but soon it became obvious that the money wasn't following him back to Biloxi. Then they remembered the bugs Stefano had discovered in their office. They'd forgotten about Patrick's tapes. Now they were worried. Too much had been said in the offices. Do you think we'll get the money? Vetrano asked. No. There was a long pause. We'll be lucky if we're not indicted. Sandy went to Parrish's office at 10 a.m. Parrish had asked for the meeting. There was a lot of missing information about the murder, and he wanted it. What was the cause of death? And the big question, who was killed? After a short discussion, Parrish said, I have a suggestion. If your client gives me information, I can reduce his crime to accidental killing instead of capital murder. The penalty is 20 years in prison. Would he consider this? Go do it. Then we'll talk. Sandy returned to his room at the Biloxi Nugget Hotel, which he'd organized as his office. His first visitor was J. Murray Riddleton, Trudy's lawyer. Riddleton gave Sandy their suggested divorce settlement. They knew it would be changed to whatever Patrick wanted. The second visitor was Talbot Mims, the Biloxi lawyer for Northern Case. "Do you know Jack Stefano?" Sandy asked. Mims said he didn't. "I didn't think so. He's an investigator hired by Arathea, Northern Case, and Monarch Sierra to find Patrick. Look at these," Sandy said with a smile as he slid a set of photos of Patrick's burns across the table to Mims.
These were in the paper when you sued the FBI.
The FBI didn't find Patrick. We sued them to make people feel sympathetic toward Patrick. Anyway, the men responsible for these injuries were working for Stefano. Northern Case was one of his clients."
Mims hid his surprise. "Can you prove this?" he asked calmly. "What do you want?"
"The FBI can prove it. I want to talk to someone with the..." The following morning, after a phone call from Cutter, Janes and several people from his office, Parrish, and Mast, the U.S. Attorney for the district, met Sandy in his hotel room office. 2 court reporters were also present. No one smiled, but they weren't unhappy to be there. Sandy gave greetings from his client and discussed the charges against Patrick. "The government charges are serious, but they're small in comparison to capital murder. We'd like you to drop them so we can concentrate on the murder charge. We have an offer that includes money."
"We have no claim to the money," Janes said. "It wasn't stolen from the government."
"That's where you're wrong." Sandy explained how Arathea had worked with Bogan's firm to cheat the government out of $600 million. He told them about the documents and tapes. Then he said, "Here's our suggestion. We'll hand over the documents and tapes. Patrick will return the money, all of it. In exchange, the government will drop its charges. His Brazilian attorney, Eva Miranda, must be released immediately."
Janes looked at the floor.
"And it has to be done today," Sandy added, "or my client will keep the money, destroy the evidence, and spend his time in prison." "Well, let's talk about this," said Sprawling, one of the government officials with Janes. "Great idea," Sandy said, as he put a tape in the tape player. "The date was January 14th, 1992, he said. And he played a conversation between Bogan, Vitrano, and Arathea that mentioned the senator's cooperation. "Gentlemen, this is just one example," he told them when it finished. The others left the room to talk. It soon became obvious to Mast that the rest had already made their decision. "So we're going to accept it," he said, acting as if he didn't care. "Yes," Sprawling said. "We look good by getting the money back. Patrick stays in jail for a long time. We arrest more important criminals." The group returned to Sandy's office, and Sprawling spoke for them. "About the money, how much is your client willing to return?" he asked Sandy. "All $90 million. Mrs. Stefano was sleeping well again. The FBI had left their street, and the neighbors had stopped calling. Her husband was relaxed. Then, at 5:30 a.m., the phone rang. "Who's calling?" she demanded when she picked it up.
"Hamilton Janes, FBI."
"Oh, my God," she said. "Jack, it's the FBI again."
Stefano took the phone.
"Good morning, Jack. This is Hamilton Janes. I wanted to let you know that we've got the girl, Eva Miranda. She's safe. so you can tell your men to stop looking for her.
Stefano sat up. Their last hope was gone. The search for the money was finally over.
Congratulations, he said.
Look, Jack, I've sent some men to Rio. You have 24 hours to release her father. If he's not free by then, I'll arrest you and Arathea, and probably Mr. Addison at Monarch Sierra, and Mr. Gill at Northern Case.
I hear you.
And the phone went quiet. Mrs. Stefano was in the bathroom with the door locked, too frightened to face him. Stefano went to the kitchen and made coffee. He was tired of Benny Arathea. He waited an hour and then called him. When Stefano called, Benny knew his dream was over. He'd hoped to find the money and then disappear with it, just like Patrick. But he still had $1 million, and he had friends in other countries. It was time to leave, just like Patrick. He and Guy left Biloxi after dark. Guy went to Mobile, and Benny went to New Orleans. He watched closely as he drove, but didn't see anyone behind him. He went to the airport and flew to Chicago. Then on to New York at dawn. The FBI was in Boca Raton, Florida, watching Benny's home. His Swedish girlfriend was still there. She'd leave soon, they thought, and it would be much easier to follow her. It was almost dark when Paolo, his eyes covered, was led from the house. When the car stopped, he was helped from the back. A voice said,
"To your left, 300 meters, is a farmhouse with a telephone. Go there for help. I have a gun. If you turn around, I'll have to kill you."
At 2 p.m., Talbot Mims and a manager from Northern Case arrived at the hotel. Sandy took them to his office. Hal Ladd and a lawyer from Monarch Sierra joined them. Sandy repeated the information about Patrick's torture and reminded them that Stefano was working for 3 clients, Benny Arathea and their 2 companies.
"How do you plan to prove this?"
asked Mims. Sandy opened a door and asked Janes to join them. With great pleasure, Janes described the things Stefano had told them about the search for Patrick, the capture, and the torture. All done with money provided by Arathea and the 2 insurance companies.
"Any questions for Mr. Janes?"
Sandy asked happily when Janes finished. There were none. Both companies were rich, and neither company wanted this problem.
"Here's the agreement," Sandy said. "First, Northern Case is trying to recover the $2.5 million paid to Trudy Lanigan. We prefer that you drop the lawsuit. Besides, most of the money has been spent. If you do this, my client will drop his claim for personal injuries against your company."
"Is that all?" Mims asked, not believing it.
"Yes, that's it."
"Okay, we agree." Sandy gave them their settlement agreement and asked them to leave so he could talk with Ladd and his client.
"Your settlement's a bit different," he told them. "You paid Stefano twice as much as they did, and you have a lot more cash than Northern Case."
"How much do you have in mind?" Cohen, the Monarch Sierra lawyer, asked anxiously.
"Nothing for Patrick. He's very concerned, however, about the child. She's 6, and her mother spends money quickly. Patrick would like $250,000 to go into a special account for her, money that her mother can't use. Plus, he wants the same amount to pay his legal costs. Total of $500,000, paid very quietly, so your client won't be embarrassed by those pictures of his injuries."
The company was anxious to finish. "We'll do it," Cohen said. Sandy handed him copies of their settlement agreement and left. Chapter 15. Final Arrangements. Ava walked out of jail at 8:30 a.m. Mark Burke rushed her to his car and took her to the airport, where a small jet was waiting to take her to New York. He told her that from New York, she'd go to London. Ava closed her eyes and thought of Patrick. Then she noticed the car phone and asked to use it. She called her father in Brazil and had a tearful conversation. She promised to be home soon. Her legal work in the United States was almost finished, and she missed her home. In New York, the people at the British Airways check-in counter looked at her questioningly because she had no baggage. She fought to control her nerves. She couldn't be arrested again. She loved Patrick, but this was too much. In the lounge, she had coffee and called Sandy. "Are you okay?" he asked.
I'm fine, Sandy. I'm at JFK, on my way to London. How's Patrick?
"Wonderful. We've made a settlement with the government people. $113 million.
Sandy waited for her to say something.
When?
Was all she said.
"I'll have instructions when you get to London. Call me when you get to the hotel."
Tell Patrick I still love him, even after going to jail.
Later in the morning, Sandy met with Riddleton to look over the divorce settlement agreement. Trudy had already signed it, and Riddleton didn't want to see her again.
"We'll sign it," Sandy said. "There's a new arrangement involving your client and her lawsuit with Northern Case. They're going to drop their lawsuit against Trudy."
Riddleton's mouth opened. Sandy gave him a copy of the Northern Case Insurance Settlement Agreement, which he read curiously.
"What a pleasant surprise."
"There's one other thing." Sandy told him about the special account that had $250,000 for Ashley Nicole.
"Anything else?"
Riddleton asked with a broad smile.
"That's it. The divorce is finished."
Patrick was taken into the courthouse through a side door. He wore new clothes that Sandy had bought. He was pale and thin, but seemed to have no difficulty walking. Actually, Patrick felt great. Patrick began. "I had a car wreck case once. The driver was killed, and 2 people were injured. It was the truck's fault, Sandy, but the driver claimed that our client's car was speeding. We found a witness, Mr. Clovis Goodman, age 81. He tried to help the injured people in the car, but couldn't. He left without saying anything to anyone. Later we found him, but he was still too upset to talk about it. Clovis lived alone in the country, and I asked if I could visit him. He was a lonely old man who didn't trust lawyers. We drank coffee and talked about everything except the wreck. When I asked about it, he informed me softly that he was there, but he couldn't talk about it yet. I went back, and we exchanged more stories. I took him to dinner, and we stopped for a few beers. But he still couldn't talk about the wreck. After a month, I put pressure on him. I told him we'd reached an important point in the lawsuit, and it was time for him to answer some questions. He said he was ready. He had tears in his eyes and wanted to help the family in the car. They weren't speeding. We went to trial, and Clovis Goodman was the best witness I've ever seen. The jury gave our clients $2.3 million. We became friends. When he got sick and couldn't live by himself, I moved him into a nursing home and took care of his finances. At that time, I was his only friend. He hadn't heard from his relatives for years. He got very sick in January of '92. I moved him to a hospital and visited every day. On February 6th, he died. Sandy breathed heavily and closed his eyes tightly. Clovis wasn't buried, was he? He asked. No. I put his body in a freezer at my cabin. Sandy was shocked. I didn't kill anybody, Sandy. I needed a body, but he was already dead when his body burned. Sandy walked around the room, then leaned on the wall. Let's hear the rest of it, he said. I'm sure you... Sandy visited Clovis's granddaughter at the coffee shop where she worked. I have good news for you, he said. They sat at a table and had coffee. As efficiently as possible, he told her Patrick's story. She found it amusing. Give him the death penalty, she said. He didn't kill anybody. The body in the car was already dead. He just stole it. The body was Clovis Goodman, your grandfather. She looked at him with narrow eyes. He burned Clovis? Why? He had to have a dead body. Clovis was his client and friend. She looked confused. It's a crime to destroy a dead body. That means Clovis's family can sue my client. She smiled and said, Now I understand. Sandy smiled too. Yes, that's why I'm here. My client would like to make a very quiet settlement with you. How much? What's the most you'll pay? Sandy drank his coffee. $50,000. Okay. They shook hands. Sandy gave her a settlement agreement to sign and wrote a check. Ava left her London hotel and took a long walk. She looked in the store windows and then stopped for lunch. She listened to the happy people who had no idea who she was. They didn't care. She felt more like Leah Pires than Ava Miranda. She began shopping, without paying attention to the prices. She was a very wealthy woman at the moment. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, she had a meeting with the manager of Deutsche Bank's London office. His bank would wire $113 million from its Zurich office to its Washington office, following her instructions. After the wire, there would be $1.9 million in the account. Another Swiss account had $3 million. A bank on Grand Cayman held $6.5 million. A financial advisor in Bermuda had $4 million, and $7.2 million was in Luxembourg. The Swedish lady left Benny Arathia's home and put her baggage in his BMW. She sped away, went to the airport, and took a plane to London. When she landed, the officials were watching for her. Patrick sat at the end of the table with Sandy on his right and Parrish on his left. Since the government charges had been dropped, Parrish felt pressured to get justice from Patrick for the state. You can forget murder, Terry, Patrick said. I didn't kill anyone. The person in the car had been dead for 4 days. Parrish questioned him and accepted that Patrick was right. But he wasn't going to give up completely. Looks like a year in jail, he said.
A year in Parchman should be good for you.
Sure, except that I'm not going to Parchman. You don't have a body. You have no idea who was burned, and I'm not telling until we make an agreement. Drop the charges. You can't win.
The family of the dead person doesn't want to sue Patrick, Sandy said.
You can't prove anything against me. There are no witnesses, and the evidence isn't good enough.
You can't make us look like fools, Parrish said. Give us something.
I'll say I'm guilty of destroying the dead body, but I get no jail time. You can explain to the judge that the family doesn't want to sue me. You can talk about the torture and what I've been through. You can do all that, Parrish, and you'll look very good. But no jail.
Parrish thought for a minute. And you'll tell us the name of the dead person?
I will, but only after we have an agreement.
Okay, but I have to speak with Judge Trussell. He'll have to agree too.
Patrick smiled at Sandy. Parrish stood up to leave.
Oh, I almost forgot, the district attorney said. What can you tell us about Pepper Scarborough?
I can give you his new name and passport number. Sandy, Parrish, and Judge Trussell spent several hours working out a plea agreement to reduce the charges against Patrick. Sandy took it to him at the hospital. They read the agreement aloud, and Patrick signed. Sandy noticed that he was already packing. Back in his hotel room office, Sandy's phone rang. It was Jack Stefano, who was downstairs and wanted to talk.
I'm here out of curiosity.
The hearing was scheduled for 5 o'clock in the courthouse. Patrick put on new pants and a large white shirt. He shook hands with Hayani and thanked him for his friendship. After 2 weeks as a patient and prisoner, Patrick left the hospital. His lawyer was at his side, and his guards followed behind. It was supposed to be a secret hearing to complete the secret agreements, but people heard about it. In less than 30 minutes, half the city knew, and the courtroom was crowded. Patrick smiled for the photographers as he was led to the jury room. Carl entered and asked the guards to wait in the hall.
When are you leaving? He asked.
I don't know. Soon.
Can I go with you?
Would you really leave? If you had the chance to disappear right now, would you do it?
No, I wouldn't leave. But I don't blame you.
Everybody wants to disappear, Carl. At some time in life, everybody thinks about walking away. Problems can be left behind. Judge Trussell entered the courtroom. Patrick was led through the door and stood next to Sandy in front of the judge. He didn't look at his audience.
Mr. Lanigan, Trussell said, first, you've asked us to reduce the charges from capital murder to destroying a dead body.
People were surprised. Destroying a dead body? Parrish explained the recent developments in the case.
Next, it's been suggested that this court should accept a plea of guilty to the charge of destroying a dead body. Mr. Parrish?
And Parrish told the story of Clovis.
What's your plea, Mr. Lanigan? The judge asked.
Guilty, Patrick said, firmly, but with no pride.
Does the state have a recommended punishment?
Parrish walked to his table, looked through his notes, and returned to the judge's desk.
Yes, Your Honor. I have a letter from Ms. Dina Postel of Meridian, Mississippi. She's a grandchild of Clovis Goodman.
He handed a copy to Trussell.
In the letter, Miss Postel asked this court not to punish Mr. Lanigan for burning her grandfather's dead body. He's been dead for over 4 years, and the family doesn't want any more suffering. So the state recommends a punishment of 12 months in jail.
They drove into Louisiana in silence. Then Sandy said,
I had a very interesting visitor this afternoon.
Really? Who?
Jack Stefano. He visited me at the hotel. He said he was sorry his boys injured you so much when they caught you. He told me about the person in Brazil who gave him information about you and about the Pluto group. And he asked me directly if Ava sold the information. He's curious because he found his man but didn't get the money.
For the last 3 years, I've been chased in my sleep by 100 men. All of them were hired by Jack Stefano. I finally got tired of it, Sandy. I gave up. Disappearing is an adventure until you learn that someone's trying to find you and is watching everything you do. I stole too much money, Sandy. They had to come after me. When I learned they were already in Brazil, I knew the end would come. So I decided to do it my way, not theirs. Patrick breathed heavily, looked out the window, and tried to organize his thoughts. The rewards were my idea, Sandy. Ava flew to Atlanta, where she met the Pluto group. We paid them, and we gave Stefano information. Sandy turned slowly, his mouth open.
You're lying, he said. I know you're lying.
No. We collected $1,150,000 from Stefano. It's hidden now, probably in Switzerland with the rest of it.
You don't know where it is?
She's been taking care of it. I'll find out when I see her. Sandy was too shocked to say anything else. Patrick continued. I knew they'd capture me, and I knew they'd try to make me talk. But I didn't know this would happen. He pointed to the rope mark above his left ankle. They almost killed me. I finally gave up and told them about Ava. By then, she was gone, and so was the money.
They almost killed you, Sandy said.
That's true. But 2 hours after I was captured, Ava called Cutter in Biloxi, and he called the FBI in Washington. That's what saved my life. Sandy took him to his mother's house and drove away. In the morning, Patrick woke up smiling. His life of hiding was over. He and his mother talked, drove around the city, and did some shopping. Then Patrick went to the airport. He flew to Atlanta, and from there to Nice, France. He'd last seen Ava a month earlier, in Rio. She'd almost persuaded him to run and hide again. But he was tired of running. They'd said goodbye near her apartment. He'd kissed her and walked away, leaving her crying. He flew back to Ponteporra and began waiting. On Sunday, when the train from Nice arrived in Aix, Patrick took a taxi to the Hotel Galicia. She'd reserved a room in both names, Ava Miranda and Patrick Lanigan. But she hadn't arrived yet, the clerk informed him. He went to the room, unpacked, and fell asleep, dreaming of her. When he woke up, he went for a walk. Maybe they'd live here. They'd stay here for a week or so, then go back to Rio. But maybe Rio wouldn't be home. Feeling free, Patrick wanted to live everywhere, to experience different cultures, to learn different languages. He refused to worry. He waited until dark, and then walked slowly back to the hotel. She wasn't there, and there was no message. He called the hotel in London and was informed that she'd left yesterday. He called her father. She was in London, Paolo said. He would say nothing more. Patrick waited 2 hours and then called Sandy. "She's missing," he said, now frightened. Sandy hadn't heard from her. Patrick stayed in Aix for 2 days, walking, calling Sandy and Paolo. Alone in his room, he cried from a broken heart. He drank too much alcohol. On the 3rd day, he left, asking a clerk to keep an envelope at the desk for Ms. Miranda if she arrived. He flew to Rio. He wasn't sure why. She was too smart to go to Rio. Patrick had taught her too well how to disappear. No one would find Ava, unless she wanted them to.